My name is Kyle Moore, and I'm going to be presenting work that's feeding into my dissertation. This is going to be one of the first chapters, or the first chapter of the dissertation, titled Stratification and Stress-Related Morbidity at Older Ages. And the way I structured this talk today is essentially as a discussion of the framework. Right now, the work is ongoing. And I'm happy to say that very recently, I think as of 2 weeks ago, I did get access to the restricted data I need. I had my data plan approved from the HRS. So the empirical results are going to be forthcoming. I have some preliminary results I can share right now just from playing around with the hypotheses that I put together. But let's get right into it. So this is an overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to give my motivation for doing this research. Then I'm going to compare and contrast two different approaches to this health disparities question that social scientists can take. I'm going to talk about stratification economics and how that plays into the discussion of health disparities. Then, talk about which disparities we're trying to explain here. And then that will kind of build to the main questions I'm trying to answer here and the hypotheses that I'm trying to prove. And then the latter half of the discussion will essentially be my data plan, the identification strategy I'm trying to implement to get at some of these questions. I'll talk about some of the preliminary results and then see where the future can go, where the research can go into the future. So let's try to build this framework out, right? So why study racial disparities, generally speaking, right? So stark racial and economic divisions have been and continue to be one of the defining features of American life. And you see these basically everywhere you look throughout American society, in income and wealth, in education, access to safety and security and health. Now, these are fundamentally unjust given the history of the country and where these disparities come from, but they also represent a drag on the economy's full potential. As social scientists, we kind of have privileged access to the information that might be needed to address these disparities. And we're privileged in that we get to spend our time learning about human life and human well-being. And with that knowledge comes, I think, with a sort of responsibility to try to inform and influence policy on behalf of the disadvantaged or those who have less time or less access to that information. So in this sense, and in this sense, the study of health disparities is perhaps maybe vital in a sense, right? So in addition to concerns about fairness, people's lives are at stake when we're talking about health disparities. And so if we're social scientists and we have access to this information, then it's our duty to do something about it. So that's kind of the idea for pursuing racial disparities as a general frame. Now, talking about health disparities, there are a couple different approaches that folks have taken in the past to dealing with these questions. One you could call a neoclassical approach. And that approach, essentially, you can think of like the demand for health, health capital, and health production models of folks like Gary Becker, Ken Arrow, and Michael Grossman in this sort of methodologically individualist tradition. So they situate health as both a consumer good and as capital, with investments in that taking place as individual optimizing decisions, influenced by an individual's preferences, their evaluation of the present versus the future, and the uncertainty they have of survival into the future. There was a good article Gary Becker's last article in 2007, where he kind of summarizes that body of research. Now, the neoclassical approach, I think, has some use in explaining differences in health between otherwise identical individuals. Now, problems might arise if you try to apply that framework to understanding group-based disparities, because the tools that you have in that framework essentially leave you going into one of two approaches. You're either trying to explain group-based disparities as a result of some group-based dysfunction, which causes members of disadvantaged groups to engage in poor health behaviors, or you're looking at some inborn genetic predisposition towards poor health. Now, it's not to say that behavior doesn't matter in determining health. It's not to say that genetics aren't important in determining health outcomes. But when we're looking at population level disparities, there's a lot of evidence that it pays to look at population level, or I should say structural causes for those things that happen at group levels to rather than just individuals. And so that kind of leads you to think about another approach that you might call the political economy approach to health. It centers things like class, the social structure, and different power dynamics. So this is derived a lot from what you might call the determinants of health tradition. You might hear social determinants of health or economic determinants of health. More specifically, in my usage, I'm drawing from the works of Robert Chinomis and Ian Hudson, in 2013 book called To Live and Die in America. And that kind of shifts the focus from individual behavioral decisions to the importance of political and economic environment in determining population level health trends. And so why do this? If you look historically at the most significant reductions in mortality and morbidity that has happened, at least in the US context, these are a result of politically determined and hard-won improvements in economic and living conditions. So you have sanitation, labor laws, environmental regulations. These sorts of things are what really move the needle in terms of determining health outcomes. And even today, we can see the role of class in determining health, in the sense that life expectancy gains have disproportionately gone to those at the higher ends of wealth, income, and educational distributions. And disease burden is faced disproportionately by those at the bottom ends. And so as we see increasing wealth and income inequality, and education moving consistently more out of reach for folks, that political economy approach would suggest that if we do nothing, then further polarization could lead to further health inequality as well. Right, so how does stratification economics fit into this? So stratification is this process by which dominant identity groups create laws, shape institutions, and enforce policies and norms such that dominant groups maintain and improve their position relative to subaltern groups. Now, the United States is marked by a long history of racial stratification, in which Black and other non-white groups have been disadvantaged relative to their white counterparts in nearly every facet of social and economic life. And so stratification economics is this growing community of social scientists that are combining economic tools with social psychology and sociology to try to understand how group-based disparities manifest. Its key assumptions are that disparity is rational and to the benefit of dominant groups to the expense of subaltern groups, and that those disparities that exist won't be eliminated without concerted policy effort to that effect, rather than simply the unimpeded operation of the market. And so if your core assumption of stratification economics is that group-based inequality is generally the result of decisions made at this institutional level, what does that mean for health? So a stratification approach to health disparities will focus on one of a few things: either the historical circumstances that lead to disparity, the institutions and laws or lack thereof which allow disparity to perpetuate, and or the material conditions that constitute the basis for disparity. So to think about it in a kind of simple way, if neoclassical economics is theorizing individual causation of inequality, then the political economy approach or a stratification approach might be thought of as theorizing structural causation of inequality. And so which disparities are we really talking about here, right? So disparities in life expectancy and incidence of sickness are a persistent feature of our stratified society. Black Americans are disadvantaged in health outcomes across the life course, from infant mortality to healthcare coverage, and this results in shorter and sicker lives compared to their white counterparts. Now, in the modern age, disparities in chronic diseases are particularly important, as they're the leading cause of death in the United States. And Blacks do indeed suffer from higher rates of chronic disease across the life course, which leads to both lower survivability to old age and increased morbidity at older ages through a process of accumulating disadvantage. And now, one of the major sources of chronic disease is stress, chronic stress. So we can think of allostatic load can be thought of as this wear and tear placed on the body as a result of chronic activation of the systems the body has in place to mitigate stressful situations. It's typically measured as a collection of morbidities, but some of which are particularly important Hypertension and inflammation, for example, are major risk factors for heart disease, which is the #1 cause of death in the US. Now, scholars in social psychology, epidemiology, and sociology have put together what's known as a biopsychosocial model, which kind of investigates the role that stress induced by racial oppression, stigma, and discrimination plays in, it kind of gets into the way that plays into racial disparities in health, particularly through activation of chronic disease. And there's a research tradition that's really pioneered by social scientist David Williams that investigates the role of everyday discrimination in worsening physical and mental health among Black Americans. And alongside that, there's this research that looks into the same health consequences for facing financial strain. And so what kind of tied this together for me was in 2017 American Psychological Association article, or report I should say, that looks at racial disparities called stress and health disparities. And they define stress as where an individual appraises the resources available to them as inadequate for meeting a particular situation's demands. All right, so you have these demands in excess of the resources available. So now, given what we know about the political economic approaches to health, the history that this country has had with racial stratification, the role that stress seems to play in the literature in determining the risk of chronic disease and the persistent disparities in chronic disease that we see in the United States, that leads you to a few, I think, natural questions to ask, right? And those are the main questions that I'm looking to answer. These are: one, are Blacks indeed more likely to experience this combination of high exposure to potential stressors and low economic resources that I would operationalize as stress? Two, is that combination of high exposure to potential stressors and low economic resources associated with higher rates of hypertension and inflammation? And then finally, how much of the disparity that we see in hypertension and inflammation between Blacks and whites is indeed due to differences in their incidence of exposure to potential stressors and low resources? So what I'm essentially trying to do here is operationalize that psychological definition of stress in an economic context. So the hypothesis that I have is that under-resourced in terms of wealth and annual earnings, older working Americans, 55 to 64, in 2006 and 2008, who face higher exposure to psychosocial and economic stressors, will face higher levels of blood pressure and inflammation in 2010 and 2012 than those with either adequate resources or fewer stressors. And further, Black-white disparities in high blood pressure and inflammation can be partially explained by this concept of stress. And right, the reason that I'm looking at, well, I'll get into why I'm working. The reason I'm looking at older workers in particular is because when you're looking at chronic disease outcomes, looking at younger populations isn't necessarily as useful because the effects of that chronic stress haven't quite onset yet. But when you go too far into the lifespan, folks start to die off. So when you're looking at that kind of prime age difference between like age 45 to maybe 65 is where the disparities really get to their largest amount. So I figured, let's target this area. And so that's basically the way that I've built the framework. And now I'm going to spend some time talking about the data I'm using, the methodology I'm trying to use here, and then I'll get into some preliminary results. So the basis for this study is the health and retirement study. It's a biennial panel, older Americans and their spouses. It's nationally representative. And it started in 1992 with this cohort from 51 to 61 years old, and has added cohorts over time, such that it's now fully representative of the aging population in the US. It's important because it collects data on health, work history, things like retirement satisfaction, income, and wealth, in addition to detailed demographic information. So it's possible to track the aging US population's life course with this data, and it's really one of the only data sets that has health information and wealth information in the detail necessary to, and psychosocial information in a detail that's necessary to do this type of work. And I'll get into some of the more detailed pieces of data that I'm looking at now. Well, right now, just to talk about some of the measured resources I'm using here. Annual income and total wealth are both collected by the HRS. Income's relevance to wealth is that it allows for the purchase of higher quality inputs to health. Total wealth provides protection against negative health shocks, and it can represent quality of a living environment through the contribution of home value. And for the purposes of my study, I'm looking at folks who are in the bottom quintile of either income or wealth. Now, there's an additional module called the Enhanced Face-to-Face Interview, which the HRS implemented as a pilot in 2004, but fully in 2006. And it's a further rotating biennial panel where half the sample is sampled every 2 years. So essentially you end up with short panels following 4 years. So from 2006 to 2010, you have one group, 2008, 2012, you have another group, for example. One of the things they do in the enhanced face-to-face interviews is collect biomarker information. So they're getting saliva samples, blood spots, things like grip strength and lung capacity. But what this does is give you even more detailed information. And that's, I think, crucial to doing work like this. And so the health outcomes that I'm looking at in particular are hypertension through the measurement of blood pressure and inflammation. One of the interesting things I realized in doing this work, I started off by saying I want to get purely objective measures here. But the CDC actually recommends using folks who have doctor-reported hypertension or are reported taking blood pressure medication as counting for hypertensive as well. Of course, that makes sense because you might have someone with an underlying issue caused by the material conditions they live in or their exposure to stress, but you might not see it if it's being managed, right? So if you want to count the people who are hypertensive, you need to include these folks as well. The other part that I'm using from the enhanced face-to-face interviews is the Leave Behind Psychosocial Questionnaire. And that's going to be essential for getting access to folks' experiences with everyday discrimination and financial strain. So essentially what they do is they leave a survey with the HRS respondents for them to fill out once the interview is completed. And it has a suite of psychosocial questions to ask things like what stressful experiences you've had in the past, things like psychological disposition. Is a really detailed and rich data source. Unfortunately, the questions related to discrimination were significantly cut in 2014, such that the best we have is really 2006 to 2012 to get that detailed information. And so I have in here I started off with a broader suite of psychosocial questions, but as I did more research, what I realized is that if we're looking at the incidence of chronic disease, then you really need to look at not acute instances of stress. So I was looking at stressful events at first, or I was looking at whether or not someone had ever had a major experience of discrimination. But there's no real necessary link between the incidence of something having happened and the onset of a chronic disease unless there's rumination on that event over time. But instead, we can look at things like things that are happening on an everyday basis, or things that characterize your general living situation, such as financial strain or experiences of everyday discrimination. And this is the basic model that I'm working with here. So the idea is that the race you're assigned, essentially born into in this context, affects whether or not you're exposed to these high psychosocial demands or these low resources, or if the resources you have access to are limited. Those two factors combined produce stress, which then leads to or potentially leads to these outcomes of hypertension and inflammation. And these are important because they are risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Now, a lot of folks who have done this research in the past are probably thinking about endogeneity concerns, right? This relationship, or whether or not the relationship between health and SES, or what direction it flows. So this is a famously endogenous relationship, and that relationship could come either from the fact that health provides the capacity to gain income or wealth, or that wealth and income lead to better health outcomes. Honestly, of course, it's both, Both of these things are true, but if you're trying to measure the impact of wealth and income in particular on health, you need to have some strategy for identifying that effect. And to try to account for endogeneity, I have exogeneity there. To try to account for endogeneity, I'm proposing to use instrumental variables analysis. And I have now the geographic information required to do this, but I want to talk a little bit about what I'm trying to do. So what I want to do is use county level statistics as instruments. So I'm trying to use county level home values as an instrument for wealth, and I'm trying to use unemployment rates as an instrument for income, given that the sample is restricted to folks who are currently working. This is the kind of light example of a model I'm trying to use. I consider not having this in, but it's just something that I'm generally trying to work with. So essentially what I do with the instrumentation is try to utilize the coefficients on unemployment and home value in separate equations for income and wealth respectively, and then include them in a final model following this two-stage residual inclusion method. So that's one of the best methods I've found for accounting for endogeneity in health econometrics, or something more recent. So it's still a work in progress, but it's a kind of, just gives an idea of what I'm trying to go for here in terms of using these different measures. So when I'm instrumenting for wealth, I want to use the Zillow home. Yes, you have a question.
HRS older adult samples for counties?
Yeah, so that's what I'm actually trying to. So I'm approved to access the county level, the geographic data, but I don't have it quite yet. So potentially, if those counties, if that information is, well, every person should have a county level assignment to them, like if their geographic location is there. So I'm essentially trying to use data that I get from the home value index to match the county level home value to the individual, and then the county level under.
Kings County, New York, or Wayne County, Michigan would be quite good statistics, but other counties you might have.
Oh yeah. So it'll that's something I'm trying to work out. So we'll see once the data comes in. Right. So I'm looking at this home value index to get the data for wealth. This is publicly available information, so that's good. Don't have to go through IRB and such to get access to this. So that's what I'm using for wealth, and then for annual income, I'm trying to use unemployment rates from the CPS and ASEC. Ideally, I would use as specific of unemployment rates as I can get, like age-specific unemployment rates. And there's some significant variation in the time frame that I'm looking at. 2006 and 2010 and 2008, 2012, both span the some periods of the Great Recession, so there should be some variation in unemployment that might be useful for doing this type of work. So that's the strategy I'm essentially trying to use. And now I'll just get into some of the preliminary results that I have. So this is just kind of a breakdown of the sample size, starting with about 6,000 folks, non-Hispanic, Black or white respondents between that age range, 2006 to 2008. And it kind of pairs down when you look at folks who are working, folks who have consistently answered both questionnaires and have non-missing responses. I don't know what I just did. And but a final survey count for folks who answered every question that you have is about 2,000 white respondents, about 300 Black respondents. And this is basically what I have so far, some descriptive stuff. It's not super, it might be kind of clear, maybe folks can see this. But it's essentially showing that indeed Blacks are under-resourced as compared to older whites. So we have the percentage of Blacks who are low wealth, low income, and either of those two things, being about half of older Blacks have either low wealth or low income, as compared to about a fifth of whites. And then they do indeed face chronic psychosocial stressors at higher rates than older whites. So everyday discrimination and financial strain are indeed faced at higher rates for older Blacks. And so that both combines into having this the combination of those two things, which is stress, so about 37% of older blacks face both high exposure to psychosocial resources, psychosocial demands, and low resources, as compared to about 16% of older whites. And so this is essentially showing the effects of stress versus having no stress on hypertension and inflammation, and I included having fair or poor health as well. So the idea here is that for the folks who are stressed, for folks who do have that particular combination of high exposure to potential stressors and low resources, they do indeed, for both blacks and whites, have higher levels of hypertension, higher levels of inflammation, and are more likely to report their health as being fair or poor as opposed to good or excellent. So that's the idea there. So what does this mean for the future, right? So what I really want to, the idea that I want to support with this research is essentially that the health and the economy are fundamentally linked, right? And that when we're doing policy, when we're doing policy that's going to affect health outcomes, we need to think of that as part of our economic policy as well. And similarly, when we're trying to improve or reduce economic inequality, we need to look at that as a part of a public health strategy. And so, to that end, this work provides additional support for pursuing policies directed at reducing racial gaps in wealth and income, from larger projects like reparations to slightly smaller but still quite large projects like the federal job guarantee, things that are going to ensure that folks have a basis of material resources to be able to mitigate, the psychosocial stresses that they face. And in terms of future research for this, I'm still really interested in this concept of whether or not this affects people's decision to leave the labor market. Like, if folks who are exposed to this type of stress are more likely to exit the labor market early, for example, that could have some implications for retirement security that I'm really interested in. And I've kind of played around with this a little bit and seen that there is some relationship between these folks who are exposed to this kind of stress and early labor force exit. I don't know if it's necessarily a cause of disparity in early labor force exit between blacks and whites quite yet, but I have seen that it does, these folks do end up leaving earlier who are exposed to this type of stress. And yeah, so that's essentially the idea. That's what I'm working on right now. So we can open it up to have a discussion about these ideas and what folks think, and if folks have things to add, then I'm open for it. So thanks. Sure. Oh yeah, I don't know how the mic gets to you.
So I have a question. Is this on?
I don't think so. I'd say just try to project, but I don't know if it's gonna catch for the recording.
So my question is, if you're using housing prices to IV for wealth, what do you think about renters? And if there are disparities between whites and blacks in terms of renting, or between urban and rural areas, between owning homes and renting homes, how have you tried to accommodate for that?
Right. So I think the idea that I'm working with here is that, well, at least I'm hoping that the folks who are low wealth live in generally lower wealth counties, and that'll account for the presence of renters to some extent. It's something I could look into more, though. I haven't explicitly dealt with the concept of the role that renting might play in the analysis, but I'm hoping that the fact that folks tend to live in relatively segregated areas might account for that to some extent. But it's something I'll definitely to look into more, for sure, for sure. Should write that down, actually. Other thoughts? Hey,
So
Baker.
one of the things I was thinking about in terms of instrumenting for, because you look at the impact of racial health, I think of, I forgot who did it, either Lisa Cook or Javon Logan, on looking at the lynchings in a county.
Sure.
And so like that might have that historical impact of like stress. I think it was looking at voting or like political
Yeah,
participation.
I do remember that
But
project.
that might be something to use as an instrument, see what they did to kind of get that historical residential segregation impact since you have the county data.
Right. No, that's I do remember that project being done, and it's something I haven't considered in this context, but it could definitely play a role, particularly in the sense that I imagine in places where this has happened, folks might end up facing higher levels of psychosocial stress as well. So that's definitely something I'll think about more, for sure, for sure.
Excellent project. I'm really excited to see
appreciate
where it ends up.
Sure. Me too.
I'm curious more so, I bet you are. I'm curious more so on the tax side of things. So if an older person lived in a more progressive tax structure state with their hypertension or inflammation, have an impact or effect for that? Did you control for that? So like California, I think you were talking about New York and Kings County and Wayne County, but like literally having a millionaire's tax in your state makes a difference or not. You mentioned that a policy recommendation would be a reparations or a job guarantee. I can see a tax structure policy somewhat maybe having that same influence. So have you looked and say like, regressive tax structures like in Alabama might have even worse effects compared to someone in California or not? I'm curious if that's something you ever thought about.
Well, so I guess not in those explicit terms, but the extent to which I have dealt with that idea, the basic HRS does have census region in that basic data set. So I've been trying to control for region as well, or in particular, I've controlled for whether or not a person is residing in the South. But looking at individual states is something that's going to be possible now that I have access to that detailed geographic information. So that's something to consider as well. I haven't considered specific state tax policy, but you're right. I think that is relevant for determining things like who has access to what healthcare, and so. And it's interesting to hear that tax structure does have that impact. So yeah, that's something I'll look into as well, for sure.
Along the same vein as taxes, especially once you're able to look at geographic level, I'm thinking about your end goal of really connecting health to economic and economic outcomes, both in terms for individuals and then the investments that we make in people and their returns for our broader economy. And I'm wondering if you have any plans, or maybe if you'll have the ability to look at Medicaid expansion. And particularly, I was wondering if the HRS data will let you tease out. I thought it was fascinating that you mentioned that you can't just look at incidences of stress and hypertension, but people who are also being treated for that. How much will the HRS data allow you to differentiate between those who are experiencing stress and the implications but are being treated for it versus those that are experiencing it and not actually receiving treatment?
So I will say that is something that you can do with that data. You can make that distinction. I think what I've done, at least in these results so far, is I have those folks all considered as hypertensive, just following the CDC and using folks who are, because they say if you're looking at folks who are currently being treated, consider that as being a part of hypertensive. But I had qualms about doing so, and I think there's something to that. So there is a question as to whether or not a doctor has said that you have hypertension, and then a follow-up question whether or not you're currently managing that hypertension. And so that's a distinction that can be made. And I do know there has been some relatively recent work done on Medicaid expansion. looking at similar issues. I think they were looking at mental health issues, or it might have been substance abuse issues. But I think that's work that I could look to for inspiration and moving it forward. So, good suggestion. Sure.
Yeah, I like that idea, and I know that there's also research looking at the effect of Medicaid expansion on labor force participation. So that also sort of gets at that, but that research, to my knowledge, is like doesn't sort of dig at the underlying mechanics by which Medicaid expansion would increase labor force participation. So I think this would go with that really well. But your sample is probably too small for you to test it yourself. If there's like a before expansion and after expansion cohort within the states that expanded, and expanded the threshold too, would be really interesting, where they went from, at the poverty line to double the poverty line or something like that. But I have the code for state-by-state Medicaid expansion if you need it.
Well, I'm always interested in new code, done code. So I'll definitely hit you up on that for sure. Well, sure.
Non-policy question,
Sure.
and probably your sample is probably too small, but I was wondering, is there any information on the stress? Your cohort starts with people born in 31 to 41, and that's at the tail end of the migration. Is there any information on the level of stress associated with the migration from the South? I mean,
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I mean, it's an interesting question, So that would be, you're saying like folks who migrated versus folks who maybe didn't?
yeah, exactly. What the effect of it is. One can imagine it could be positive, one can imagine it could be negative.
Sure. It probably won't be part of this paper, but that's an interesting question that I haven't really considered yet. So that's cool. That's cool thoughts.
Actually, just going off his point, do you have information about where they were born? Because there's probably going to be data about
Yes.
migration patterns in those states, and you might be able to control for that by saying, okay, you're born in Alabama, and there's probably a way to kind of control for that with data about migration patterns to throw it in there.
I think that data is in the HRS. I think where the person's born, yeah, that's there. So I can sure, look that up as well. Place data as well. Cool. Well.
I'm curious whether you have any. Nope, I don't get to use my own microphone again. So I think part of what's really interesting about this is thinking about what the causes of stress are, right? I mean, which is obviously like 8 separate papers, probably, right?
Sure.
But I'm curious, I mean, there have been we've sort of talked around that, I think, with Medicaid expansions as like a potential mitigator of stress, but I'm wondering if you have kind of a potential theory, and I'm asking you to like speculate on a next paper, I guess, but of like what, if you're thinking about policy solutions, I imagine part of what you'd want to do to drill down would be thinking about how do you actually mitigate specific kinds of stress, right? I mean, you could make an argument that stress comes from just not having money, and I'm cool with that argument. So the kind of the reparations and the federal job guarantee totally makes sense as kind of a start. But I think as you think more about what a broader policy agenda would be, it'd be really interesting to think about whether you can kind of empirically identify what specific stressors, particularly in the context of stress caused by inequality, what those might look like. And I'm just curious if, first of all, if that makes sense at all, and second of all, if it does, kind of where you think you might take that line of thinking.
Yeah, that is something that I think about a lot. And the way I've tried to operationalize stress is kind of designed to get around that question to some extent, because I'm thinking of stress as only really being activated in the presence of I guess, in a situation where you don't have the resources to mitigate it, right? So I'm saying, and I'm trying to operationalize those resources as being explicitly economic. But you're right, I mean, there's definitely a incidence component of the psychosocial stressor or I'm calling it a potential stressor happening to you, and how do you stop that? And I'm looking at things like everyday discrimination and financial strain. I think everyday discrimination is something that's particularly tough to tackle from a policy perspective. I mean, there are things that you could potentially do if these things are coming from the workplace, or if these things are kind of broader hate crime type things, but I don't think that's the spirit of the questions, right? These are just like, are you being consistently underestimated? Are you being consistently perceived as a threat? And your assessment of those sorts of events, which are, they kind of point towards more broad cultural shifts, which are difficult to try to implement through policy. But in terms of financial strain, I think that's something that you can do something about. Just, providing folks with resources to manage things like bills getting out of control. So different sorts of safety net. There are different things that we can do with the safety net to ensure that folks don't feel financial strain, even if they have less income or less wealth, right? That doesn't guarantee that folks are going to be insecure. So we can do things like that, and I think that would reduce the stress burden in that way. But like I said, as for the everyday discrimination piece, it's a bit tougher. Yeah, for sure.
I'm not sure this is a question, but I wanted to maybe provide input into the discussion that you and Elizabeth are having in thinking about how you're operationalizing stress, and specifically if you're doing it in a context of looking at race, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing you saying is that one way that stress is racialized is that African Americans are disproportionately sorted into these kind of low resource slots in the socioeconomic spectrum. And I think when you look at it only through that lens, then these ideas of kind of race neutral policy solutions are appealing, because that kind of lens says the experience of a poor Black family is equivalent or similar to the experience of a poor white family. But I think what your framework presents to us is that a poor Black family and a poor white family in identical financial circumstances will actually have different levels of stress, with the poor Black family experiencing greater levels of stress and therefore greater health problems because of this discrimination component. So this is not that helpful, but just like a thought that it seems really important to kind of push this question further, especially if you're making a policy recommendation about a race-targeted versus a race-neutral policy, and why a race-targeted program might be really necessary to address this health gap.
Sure. I think that's exactly right. Yeah, sure.
To just piggyback off of that, one thing that struck me in the charts was that actually the gap between white and Black was smallest for everyday discrimination as compared to the other stressors, which I thought was really interesting. There was still a racial gap, but like it was only 10 percentage points as opposed to like 30 percentage points, which I thought was really interesting to that point.
Yeah, and I can speak to that to some extent. So there's a bit of I should say, discussion in the social psychological literature about how to assess the effects of everyday discrimination and how that relates to where the individual attributes that discrimination. So right now I've decided to not differentiate between the type of discrimination being experienced, and I'll say from looking at the data, lots of the discrimination that folks report facing is age-based discrimination, right? So there's age, there's race, ethnicity, age, nationality, gender. So all of these factor into everyday discrimination that folks face. Now, one thing I could do is say, okay, I only care now about racial discrimination, but I feel like that's not, at least in my view or my understanding of the research literature so far, that's not necessarily faithful to the idea that everyday discrimination is supposed to have negative health impacts. If I restrict it to just health, then of course it's going to be if I restrict it to just race, of course it's going to be a racial disparity, given that we live in the United States and that's the way that these things go. But I wanted to continue to include other types of identity discrimination to be faithful to that idea. So, but you're right, that gap is small, and but that's the reason, right? Yeah. Sure.
Quick question. Earlier, you talked about the employment piece and then how the early labor market forced exit. And I was wondering, did you consider the first fired, last hired phenomenon or control for that in any way? And is there any anxiety that's associated with that as a person that's experiencing this like everyday discrimination that could cause these things?
Right. So let's see. So initially, I had in some of my earlier work, I was looking at the relationship. I mean, so major experiences of discrimination are something that are considered in the data, right? And among those major experiences of discrimination are being unfairly hired, unfairly fired, or not hired, and then the attribution of that to particular aspects of your identity, be that your race, your gender, your age. The reason I haven't included that is mostly because, I'm looking at chronic health outcomes, and that's an acute instance of something happening to you. And further, for those major experiences of discrimination that are measured, there's not a, it could have happened at any point in your life. And so that makes it difficult to guarantee that there's going to be a chronic effect of having ruminated over that thing. It could very well be that a person recognizes that this has happened to them, and it happened to them because of their identity, and that allows them to cope with it in some way. So it gets complex when you're trying to do attribution and stuff like that, when you're not looking at something that's currently happening and has been happening, or when you're not looking at something that's a general characteristic of a person's life. So that's why I haven't included that here. Yeah.
I may have missed this, but do you look at gender differences within race?
So I haven't broken this out by gender. Just sample sizes for the Black group get kind of small there, which is disappointing. But it's important to look into. I recognize that that's an important issue, but yeah, it's hard to drill down.
It'd be interesting if eventually you could, because your theory applies, like there's probably a multiplicative effect, assuming like your hypothesis holds around stress and the accumulation of stress. You'd imagine that the accumulation of stress across both race and gender for minority women, especially Black women with kids.
For sure.
Black single women with kids. You can just imagine it kind of multiplying, and it'd be interesting if you are able to get your hands on data that let you identify that, to take kind of your big picture result and show how it kind of cascades,
right,
if it does, which
sure.
it probably does.
Yeah, probably does.
Because you're probably right.
Yeah, for sure.
I just wanted to quickly say, as someone who is more on the policy side and not as familiar with the research side, I really, really liked and appreciated that you opened with an explanation of big picture framework and like neoclassical versus the stratification framework for thinking about what kind of questions that's going to lead a researcher to ask, or like what kind of factors it would lead a researcher to ask. It was like really helpful for helping think about with other research into health disparities as well, being able to like make sense of based on this, like based on like the neoclassical model, what are they going to be asking, or what kind of factors are they going to be emphasizing? So I thought that was really cool that you opened with that background.
All right, I appreciate that, and that's aside from the academic piece of me just thinking that's a better way to think about these issues, that's kind of part of why I want to do work like this, generally speaking, to try to reorient folks towards, not only thinking about behavior, because that's kind of the dominant way that folks have thought about racial disparity for quite some time. It's like there must be differences in the way that these individuals in this disadvantaged group are behaving that lead them to have worse health outcomes. They're behaving suboptimally for some reason, And I've wanted to kind of build my work towards looking at other issues, looking at the sort of fundamental things that might be happening to all folks who are in similarly socially located positions that might lead to worse outcomes for them. Because I think that's really the way that you, that provides us, if anything, with the best policy levers for dealing with it. So I'm glad that you got that from it, because that's definitely what I was going for sure. Thanks.
I've been re-empowered with my own way. If there aren't additional questions, I would love to just have everyone thank Kyle for what was happily said was a great presentation. And also to thank all of you, of course, for coming. Please come back. Don't leave anything behind. Look at the floor. We're moving, as I said, so if you leave it behind, we'll have to move with it. We don't want to do that, so take your stuff. And please take food with you when you go. If there's any left over, which there usually is, we want to send you home with to-go bags. Our next seminar will be on April 4th with Alexander Hertel Fernandez, who is an assistant professor of international and public affairs at Columbia and also an Equitable Growth grantee. He will be presenting new research examining what aspects of labor organization are preferred by workers and management, which is a research agenda seeking to better understand what workers want from labor organizations and how employee preferences differ across industries and occupations. So anyone who's interested in the future of labor should totally come hear Alex talk. He's great. That'll be at our new office, which is at 1156 15th Street Northwest, Suite 700. That will be in the invite, don't worry. It's just 2 blocks from here. It's above Pete's, like that way. So we will see you there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.